Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again. Our continuing series where we interview writers, thinkers, philosophers, professors, anybody who's really out there paying attention and has a brain. We don't care if you're on the left or on the right or that you have an agenda. We simply want to do a series of thoughtful interviews for you, the public, because we don't find anybody doing that in the media on the left or the right. With us today is Alex Newman. He's the senior editor and foreign correspondent for New American Magazine. He's also an award-winning international journalist. He's the CEO and executive editor of Liberty Sentinel Media, and he's a contributor to the Epoch Times. Alex Newman is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything that he does. You can find many of his essays at Substack. Substack.com. Simply look for Alex Newman, AlexNewman. In addition to serving as president of the small media and information consulting firm Liberty Sentinel Media Incorporated, he has written for a wide array of publications in the United States and abroad. He currently serves as the contributor to WND, World Net Daily, and education writer for Freedom Project Media, a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine, a contributor to the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, and more. He has also written for numerous newspapers and magazines such as the Gainesville Sun, Liberty Magazine, the Diplomat Magazine, that's a good one, Crisis Magazine, very impressive, Swiss News Magazine, Sunshine State News, Campus Reform, Alachua County Today, and many more. His work has been featured at Drudge, Breitbart, Fox News, and many other outlets, and his writing has been published in major newspapers across America. Contributor to the Epoch Times, co-author WND Books, CEO, executive editor, Liberty Sentinel Media, and senior editor and foreign correspondent, the New American Magazine. Did we get anything wrong? Is there something that we need to correct? A new place that you're at or a background?
No, that was good. My Substack is libertysentinel.substack.com. I do, a number of other things beyond what you mentioned, but that was a good roundup. So thank you.
Liberty Sentinel at Substack.
.substack, yep. .com.
Okay, so you can check him out at Liberty Sentinel at Substack. Look for Alex Newman. That's where you can find more of the essays from this journalist and this author. So let's get into it. I'm very, very excited to interview you today because we interview a lot of professors, and they did a specific study looking at a very niche aspect of political polarization. But you're more of a editor, writer, newspaper man. And the reason that I like talking to people like you is that you have a general observation. You know, your goal is to kind of pay attention, keep your eyes open, and be able to summarize and think intelligently, or summarize for the public. So let me ask you some general questions. They're going to seem silly, but this is just so the audience can follow along. Is political polarization a problem today, or is it not really a problem and it's just hype?
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at this. Now, in one sense, it is a very real problem. I believe that there are divisions being fueled in this country on purpose. Now, a lot of this actually goes back to Marxist theory and then updated versions of Marxist theory, that you've got to divide society up into separate categories, typically oppressor versus oppressed. And that looks different. For Marx, it was bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. When Chairman Mao took power, he divided people up into the black classes and the red classes. Well, in the United States, obviously, the whole poor versus rich, property owner versus not property owner, that didn't really work very well. So they came up with new divisions. Now, if your ancestors came from Europe, if you are cisgender, if you are not homosexual or some other new sexuality, if you are basically a native English speaker, if you are a man, whatever it is, you're part of the oppressor class. If your ancestors came from somewhere other than Europe, if you speak something other than English as your native language, if you are transgender, bigender, agender, new trois, free spirit, any kind of new innovative gender, you all get to be part of the oppressed class. And so in one sense, there is a very real polarization. It's being deliberately engineered. We see efforts to divide men from women. They're telling women that they're being oppressed by their husbands or whatever, that patriarchy is the root of all their ills. They're telling people with different skin tones that it's white people who are their problem, and everything that goes wrong in their life is somehow attributable to white privilege or white supremacy or systemic racism. And so you just keep manufacturing these divisions. They tell some people that Jews are the whole problem. There's some people that Catholics are the problem, that Protestants are the problem, that Democrats are the problem. You name it, anything where they can divide and create a fault line among Americans, that is being, I believe, deliberately pursued. And so in that sense, yes, it's a problem. It's a very real problem. In another sense, there must be division. In fact, Jesus Christ himself said, I came to cause division. And so there will always be division between right and wrong. There will always be division between truth and lie, truth and error. And so in that sense, there needs to be division. When there are people in society promoting ideas that are evil, when there are people in society who are promoting ideas that are dangerous, then there must be division. The rest of the population must separate themselves and say that's wrong. And so, in that sense, I think there's two different ways at looking at the polarization that we're seeing. Yes, it's being deliberately engineered. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, there is an ulterior motive here. But in another sense, yes, we need division because if we all unite around something that's wrong, or if we all unite around something that's evil, we're in big trouble.
I don't want to get into the who's engineering it just yet. Let me think about that. I got to be careful with my algorithms, but let's talk about, yeah, thank you for understanding. But let's talk about this. How long have they been trying to divide us, and has it gotten significantly worse in the last 5 years? I think the forces you're talking about sound like they've been going on for years or decades. Has it always been this bad for the last 3 decades? Has it gotten much worse in the last 5 years? Or have they've been treading along, doing what they're doing, and it's working as well as it has for the last 30 years? Or is there an uptick in the last 5? I mean, how far back does this go? Is there progress, and are they getting even more successful recently?
They are becoming orders of magnitude more successful. So we see the polarization increasing now. And that's because this was a process that took a long time to bring about. Now, if you go back to Marxist theory, Karl Marx, of course, believed that the proletariat, the working class, was inevitably going to rise up and basically smash the bourgeoisie and take power and create this dictatorship of the proletariat. Of course, that never happened. And so a lot of Marxist theorists, then people like Antonio Gramsci, people like the Frankfurt School, came to the conclusion that the real problem is that there's this kind of Christian culture that needs to be broken down before that process of revolution can really begin. And so we saw very deliberate efforts to make that happen. And it didn't take root right away. I mean, society was really under this kind of protective barrier, almost like an invisible force field. And it took generations to start even putting cracks into that force field. Now that force field has been all but destroyed. And so now the division is accelerating. It's happening more and more rapidly. They have been able to break down the critical thinking abilities, the reasoning abilities of younger generations. They have actually, it sounds kind of weird, but it's exactly what they've done. They've used behavioral conditioning, very much like what you do with circus animals, to radicalize and weaponize younger generations in a way where they can't actually be reasoned with, because what they're having is an emotional conditioned response to a given stimuli. And so we're watching now as the old order breaks down and this new order comes in, we're watching this process of polarization accelerate. And ultimately, I think the goal of this polarization that is accelerating is to break down the previous order and replace it with something new. And I think we're very rapidly approaching critical mass, if you will. And so that's going to continue accelerating, I believe, in the years ahead. Whether victory for these forces is inevitable or not, that's a whole nother question. I don't claim to know, but I don't think it's set in stone. But I do believe that the division, the polarization is going to continue accelerating, at least and until some more powerful force steps in and stops it.
Are they close to the level of polarization they wanted to cause? Their eventual goal? Are we close to that? Are they?
We are.
Off?
We are, and I think during the Black Lives Matter uprisings that we saw around the country, that really became obvious. We had in multiple cities all across the United States massive unrest that included hijacking police stations, that included burning down police precincts, that included burning down buildings, that included shooting police officers. And so, are we at the point yet where they can fracture society and have it crumble? Not quite. but we're rapidly approaching that. And, you know, they I think, thought they were going to be more successful. Back in the 60s, I think there was a time where they thought, you know, we've got them right where we want them. And yet American society proved to be too resilient. The Christian kind of moral foundations of the nation were too strong, were too resilient to be able to succeed. And so they kind of retreated a little bit, regrouped a little bit. And now I think we're approaching the phase where they think they may have radicalized us and polarized us enough to finally pull the rug out from underneath and watch the whole thing collapse.
You're talking about forces that go back to the 1960s. When we've done a lot of these interviews, people have said, you know, the 1960s was another pivotal period, a lot of disagreement with Americans, and we got through it just fine. Is now worse than the 1960s? And I think you're saying it is. And how specifically are we more in danger, a less cohesive, less strong, more divided society than we were in the 1960s, in your opinion, sir?
Yeah, there's no question that we are in much more danger today than we were in the 1960s, because even though they made a lot of progress in the 60s, even though there was a lot of unrest, there was a lot of division, there was a lot of polarization, mainstream society still held certain fundamental presuppositions. There was much more broad understanding of, you know, the benefits of the Constitution. And that was a time when, you know, even liberals claimed to love the Constitution. Even the factions that were seen as kind of at the leading edge of the unrest actually held similar values. I mean, you look back, for example, at Martin Luther King's speeches. He was constantly expressing reverence for the U.S. Constitution, for the Declaration of Independence. And he may have had a somewhat different interpretation of it than the more conservative or reactionary forces, as the left would call them. But they were still ultimately gravitating around the same basic principles, and they were united on these basic principles. It was just a question of how are these best implemented. Today, we're really coming at things from totally different worldviews with totally different presuppositions. There's no longer this unifying force that kind of brings all of us together on at least certain basic things. And so I think right now we are in far more danger than we were in the 1960s. Today, your average young American is totally clueless about these things. In fact, many of them have been brainwashed to believe that the Constitution is evil or that it upholds white supremacy, which is, of course, a radically different view than what Martin Luther King or even, you know, the Vietnam War protesters. I mean, all of these people still held to the same general values, or at least they said they did. Today, we're in a very different place, right? Today, the Constitution, all of American history, if you look at the 1619 Project, is a good example. It takes aim at the very foundational principles that the nation was founded on. It argues that the Constitution, that the Declaration of Independence, were actually secretly designed to uphold slavery. And so there's no area of unison. There's no compatibility between these two views. And I think it's simply going to result in a fracturing and then one faction ending up in control. And I believe the faction that is trying to engineer the unrest. And I don't necessarily believe that the people promoting this stuff, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones or whatever her name is, she may truly believe that idiocy. I doubt it. But the people who have made her into a celebrity, the people who have promoted this fictional narrative around U.S. history, they're certainly aware of the fact that that's fiction. But this is now being taught to children all over the country. This is now being read by millions of so-called liberals in this country who, you know, have very little in common with the liberals of even just a few decades ago. They're no longer liberal in any sense of the term. And so it's a very dangerous position we find ourselves in. And I don't know that we'll get through it as a nation.
I'm looking up Nicole Hannah-Jones. She sounds interesting. Nicole Hannah-Jones?
Yes. Or Hannah Nicole Jones. She's this New York Times writer who came up with the 1619 Project.
American is known for her civil rights. She joined the New York Times writing 20 award MacArthur. Okay, 20. Won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2020 for her work on the 1619 Project. Got it. Okay. We've talked to a lot of people here. We're still trying to talk to many more. And there does seem to be, at least some people think what you're thinking, that in the 1960s, boy, you know, people got shot at Kent State, right? Riots, you know, the riots in Chicago. I think there was 20 cities that were burning after King got killed. What a great man. But nobody said, I doubt your side won in a legitimate election and we're going to deny it 4 years. And then the next side said, and I am a liberal, but I have two eyes and they work. This is what I always tell conservatives. So liberals did it first in 2016. Okay. And then conservatives did it in 2020. You didn't have that. You didn't have people going, I think Nixon fundamentally didn't win, or I think Hubert Humphrey fundamentally should won, and I'm gonna, act like that for the next 4 years. You didn't have that. You didn't have people saying, I don't respect the Supreme Court. I don't respect the presidency. I don't care what Congress says. Let's do whatever we want. There seemed to be, like you said, they wouldn't even dare to question these universal poles of American society that kept us, like you were talking about. King was a freedom fighter, but he wouldn't even dare to go, oh, the Constitution's trash. The whole thing's garbage. Let's just throw it in the trash. Like, that's not that idea would have been anathema to them. Obviously, they would have said there were problems. Obviously, would have said it was problematic. But King believed the Constitution was a shining path forward. Maybe it wasn't always perfect, but the story was always things got better and people got more free. And that's what he liked in it versus throwing the whole thing away. He said, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but the history of this document is that people use it to get more rights. And that's a beautiful thing. Now we don't have that. Is that a fair summary, that maybe the politics were just as divisive then, but you had some common sense, even in the far right and far left, that, boy, you would never doubt an election. You would never just ignore Congress or the Supreme Court and say, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I do what I want. Like, they didn't have that idea. Am I correct? Am I missummarizing this?
No, I think that's a very good kind of condensation of what we're dealing with. Now, there are, I think, some things that are different today than there were back then. The introduction of voting machines has made it much easier, not just to question elections, but also to manipulate them. And so, there are some things that are fundamentally different. But yeah, in terms of the division of society, we're now at the point where entire institutions are being delegitimized. When the institutions were serving the function that the left wanted, for example, imposing abortion on the nation through Roe versus Wade, well, then the Supreme Court has spoken, and that's the law of the land. Now, when a lot of these radical projects that the radical left is hoping to continue to impose on America are at risk from the Supreme Court because there are more conservative justices on it today. Now suddenly we just delegitimize the entire court, or we pack the court. But ultimately, I think, I don't actually so much see this as a conflict between left and right in my understanding of how this works. Now, I believe that there are millions, maybe tens of millions of Americans who see it through that lens. Well, I'm a conservative and, I'm on the right. And then there is the radical left, and the radical left wants to destroy my country. They want to overthrow my Constitution. They want to sell out our sovereignty to the United Nations, whatever it is. And all of those things are real. There are people on the so-called radical left who are seeking to do those things. But, I believe that there are powers behind the scenes that are specifically engineering this. I've written a whole book on this, the Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. And I believe they use right and left. They use conservatives and liberals to accomplish their purposes. And I believe there is an effort now to, and actually a very prominent official during the Trump administration articulated this very well in a memo that got quite a bit of publicity. His name was Rich Higgins. He was the director of policy and planning at the National Security Council. He explained that there was, he described it as a Maoist insurgency taking place in the United States. And he said it brought together globalists and socialists and Islamists and this whole coalition that was united around, not necessarily on the specifics of what they wanted afterward, but they were united on this idea of the destruction of the United States. Not just the destruction of the United States as a nation, but the destruction of the United States even as an ideal. Those ideals that animated for centuries freedom fighters, not just in the United States, but around the world. The idea, as our founding fathers expressed it in the Declaration of Independence, that our Creator endowed us with certain unalienable rights. These are the foundational principles upon which the country is based on. And of course, they got a lot of these out of the Bible, but they also said in the Declaration of Independence that these were self-evident truths, which I happen to agree with them. They are self-evident truths. And we now have an effort to completely destroy all of that. And there are forces on the left that are being manipulated and weaponized to help accomplish that. And there are forces on the right among so-called conservatives who are being weaponized and manipulated into helping to accomplish that goal. And, division and conflict have been, at least since the days of Hegel, a critical strategy for bringing about fundamental changes. There's to give a very clear-cut example of this, there's an operation at Yale University called Skull and Bones. And the first guy to do a real, from the outside, the first guy, a historian, to do a real deep dive into this organization, he was a historian at Stanford University, Anthony Sutton, came up with this idea that, and this is how he articulated it in his book, Introduction to America's Secret Establishment and Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. He said it's not enough to just have a right. You have to have a right and a left, and then you're going to use this conflict to create the synthesis that is your ultimate objective. And we've seen that very clearly down through the years. A very obvious example was the 2004 election, where we had John Kerry, a member of Skull and Bones, and George W. Bush, also a member of
Skull and Bones, and they wouldn't talk about it in the press at all.
Precisely. And they have a conflict. And what ends up emerging? Well, exactly what we got. And so this is a process. It's a long-term strategy that has been used. And I believe as Americans today, we are increasingly falling victim to this without even realizing it on both sides of the aisle, among conservatives and liberals. And I think one day we're all going to wake up and say, oh my goodness, what have we done? We have destroyed one of the most amazing things that humanity ever had going for it, this constitutional system that, as you pointed out, was never perfect, right? And that's why the founders put in a process for amendments. We knew at the beginning that there was going to be need for some changes. We knew at the beginning that there would be defects that would have to be rectified. Slavery was an obvious example, right? They couldn't ban it right at the start like they wanted, so they put in the mechanisms where we could improve. But this is what laid the foundation. This is what set the train in motion that eventually would end slavery, not just in the United States, not just in Britain, but around the whole world, right? It was from these principles that they articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that God created us equally, that God endowed each of us with unalienable rights, that government exists to protect these rights. And we're now, again, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, we're now being manipulated in a way where they're going to use this conflict to destroy the very foundation of everything that was built on top of it. And I think at some point, liberals and conservatives will wake up and say, what have we done?
Well, let me get to that. So who is polarized? This is a debate that I'm noticing with some of the professors and the writers. I'm holding my conclusions till the end. And I want to get more data. I'm very big on having data before you say anything. But initially, and I'm not standing by this, there appears to be a preference amongst all the writers and all the professors who've been looking at political polarization. It goes something like this. It's the elites. You know, the people basically, they agree with each other. There's not that much division amongst the people. It's the elites that are making this happen. And if you could fix the elites, you know, the people would come back together. Who is polarized? Is it the American people themselves or just the elites?
It's a good question. I think the American people are polarized. I would like to say it's just the elites. In fact, I would argue that the real elites are not polarized at all. Right? They are united. And like gangsters, like mafia people, they may turn on each other sometimes. I mean, Stalin had the vast majority of his deputies executed and liquidated. So there's no honor among thieves. But I believe that the elites are united, and they are purposely introducing division and polarization among the people. 10 years ago, the idea that we would be shrieking at our neighbors at a school board meeting and over discussions about castrating little boys would have been completely inconceivable. No matter how liberal you were, you would never think to go to a school board meeting and defend the castration of 8-year-old boys as some sort of human right. I mean, it just would have been completely inconceivable. So what happened? The elites determined that this was something we needed to be debating about. So they introduced this into the schools. They knew there was going to be a powerful backlash, but they knew they could manipulate some people into supporting this idea. And presto, we have massive conflict. And if you look around, I mean, I think if you get outside of, New York and Washington, D.C., maybe San Francisco and L.A., it's a very different atmosphere. But even
Thank you.
It's true, though. But I mean, even in small towns in America today, you do see some of this division. Now, there are still, I know CNN's audience is radically smaller today than it was. I know their influence is radically smaller today than it was, but they still have, on a good night, maybe less than 1 million viewers, but they still have, people tuning in. And they have people in small towns who are tuning in, who are used to CNN and who are used to trusting CNN. And they're being told that the most important issue is trans surgeries for children and war in Ukraine. And so when they see their neighbors saying, no, that's a terrible idea, there is real division, even down in the small towns. But I do believe, when you get to and I don't mean elites like university professors, right? University professors, I don't consider them to be elites. Yes, they're important opinion molders for our society, but they're taking their orders from somewhere. Their paycheck depends on doing what the institution that they work for is asking them to do. So when you get to the real level of elites, and here I mentioned Skull and Bones is a good example. These are true elites. They bring in 15 new people every year, all of them very like-minded. I'm talking Bilderberg, right? I'm talking Council on Foreign.
Billionaires.
Yeah, not
Billionaires.
only
You're talking the
billionaires,
billionaire class, basically.
not only billionaires, but yeah, I mean billionaires
Tons of
obviously.
millionaires.
And there are some millionaires, and I don't think money is necessarily what unites them. But you do have Trump put the label deep state on it, and I think it's a very nice, simple term. I don't think it's useful unless you kind of describe what you're talking about, because some people think of deep state, they think of like the permanent bureaucracy in Washington D.C. in the intelligence community. In that case, I talk about the deep state behind the deep state, but we have a permanent architecture of institutions. The Council on Foreign Relations is a good example. Every presidential administration going back almost a century now has been absolutely dominated, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter, by members of the CFR. You look at David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, and there are corollaries to this. There are sister organizations to these in other countries, right? We have the Council on Foreign Relations here. Well, in the UK, they have the Chatham House, right? The Royal Institute for International Affairs. On the continent, they have the European Council on Foreign Relations. So these are international networks. They were described, I think, very, very well by a guy who agreed with them, Carol Quigley, professor of history at Georgetown University, a mentor to Bill Clinton. And he actually, he traced the origin of this back to Cecil Rhodes. I, as a Christian, I go back much further. I look at things through a biblical lens, and I go back and I look at, in the Psalms, multiple times we read in the Psalms that the kings of the earth, the rulers, it describes them as, are conspiring together, is what one translation says. Others say they take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed. So this idea that there are very powerful people united together for evil objectives is something that's been with us for thousands of years. Now, there have always been powerful restraints on the ability of these individuals to do whatever they feel like it. I mean, if it was up to them, we'd all be slaves or we'd all be dead. So clearly, they are not all powerful, like some people would like to suggest, that they are completely, everything that happens in the world is attributable to them. I reject that, and I think we all need to reject that, even though I think many of these elites would like us to think that way. But there is clearly a group of very powerful people who are united in their desire to have more money, more power, more control. And then the corollary to that would be we have less money, less freedom, and less control over our own lives. And these are the people who I believe, and the Bible takes it one step higher and talks about powers and principalities, right? The spiritual forces behind this. But to just keep it in the physical level, there is a group, a cabal, a deep state, whatever you want to call it, that has a vested interest in turning us against each other. So my wife thinks that it's the patriarchy that is the source of all her problems. So that my black neighbor thinks that it's white supremacy that's the source of all my problems. So that my Protestant neighbor thinks that it's the Catholics that are the source of all my problems. That the Catholic thinks that it's the Jew that's the source of all these problems. As long as we're all arguing amongst each other, we'll never notice or unite against the real elites who are actually turning us against each other.
Trying to find there it is. So I went to go see the Auschwitz Holocaust exhibit at the Reagan Library for Ronald Reagan this past week, and I went with my mom. And there was this quote that I always remember. I remember this from a boy when I was learning about the Holocaust. It goes like this. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Social Democrats, and I did not speak out because I was not a Social Democrat. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. German pastor Martin Niemöller, incarcerated 1937 to 1945. I believe he died in the Dachau concentration camp. So you don't speak out, this group, that group, that group. One day it's your turn. And I remember that as a boy, and I'm glad to see that you recall. I'm glad to see that you realize that it was the people and not just the elites. It bothers me to see people put it on the elites. Maybe the elites are pushing it, but this map in particular bothers me. It's from the Wall Street Journal, 538, and other people have corroborated this. NPR, I think even Harvard University. You can go back to 1992. That's the map in the top left corner. And red equals don't even run here if you're a Democrat, you have no chance of winning. Blue equals don't even run here if you're a Republican, you have no chance of winning. Gray equals We're open to both sides. It's a competitive election. And you can see how 1990 through to 2000, 2012, and you go up to 2016, almost all the grays wiped out. That's a 30-year period of Americans doing that because they're moving. Now, maybe the elites encourage them to do this, but in my opinion, if you've been encouraging people to do this for 3 decades, even if it was all the elites, you can't undo that tomorrow. That's generations doing that. If that's correct, how do we bring America back together? How do we heal divisions? How do we make that happen if it is the people and not just the elites themselves? Before you answer, I want to throw in, there was a Utah governor when Marjorie Taylor Greene made her statement about, the left and the right can't live together. We need a national divorce. She said, Marjorie, we don't need a national divorce. We need marriage counseling. What is marriage counseling for 300 million people that are as polarized as levels not seen since the 1960s with no background of belief in common institutions look like? How do we fix a 30-year period, sir?
I'm not sure that we can, and it breaks my heart to say that. I love America. I've lived most of my life outside of the United States, and that has really given me, I think, a special appreciation for the United States of America that I think, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of Americans do not have. Even the ones who say they are patriots, who say they love America, they don't recognize what is so special about this country. But we are not at the point. We are now at the point where it may be too far gone. This was, as you pointed out, I would go back way further than 30 years. This is a multi-generational process that's been happening. And when America was created as a nation, we were almost all, and I say almost all because obviously there are exceptions, but we were almost all united on certain basic things. We were all united by the Christian faith, right? Without having a precise number, 99+% of Americans were professing Christians during the founding era. And that was true, all the way up into the 70s and the 80s, 90+% of Americans would have described themselves as Christians. Today, that is not even close to the case anymore, depending on whose polling data you believe. It may be less than 2/3 of Americans identify as Christians. And even among those who do identify as Christians, there's been a radical polarization and fracturing within the Christian church. Where many of the folks who call themselves Christians don't take the Bible seriously. Many of them have no idea what it says. The ones who do think it's an allegory or a metaphor or just moral advice to live. And so trying to turn back the clock on that, I don't know that it's possible. But I do think there are some things that we could do that would be very helpful to at least turning down and ratcheting down the tensions, which really, if we're honest, are at a boiling point. There are hotheads on both sides who are ready to take up arms. And I think this is being encouraged, right? Robert Spencer, kind of a controversial guy, he Jihad Watch, he put out a book recently arguing that the elites actually want to stoke a civil war in America. Their goal, he said, is to trigger a civil war in this country. But one way that I think that could really be scaled back is by a radical decentralization of power, which in fact is what our U.S. Constitution calls for. And an honest reading of the U.S. Constitution will make very clear a few things. It will make clear that the states and we, the people, came together and created an institution and delegated certain powers to it. And it was very clear. It was universally understood at the time. And anybody who doesn't believe me, just go read the Federalist Papers, and they explain clearly what they meant. It was universally understood that these were specific powers and responsibilities that were being delegated either from the people or from the states to their agent, the federal government. And the bulk of that list is found in Article 1, Section 8. They can have a post office. They can have a navy. In extreme cases, if Congress determines that it's necessary, we can declare war, right? So there are some powerful authorities that the federal government has. But they don't have the authority to tell me what kind of medical treatment I should take. They don't have the authority to tell my kids' school what textbooks they should be reading. They don't have the authority to tell my local government that they need to what they need to do at the bathrooms. And so one way that a lot of these divisions and polarizations could be scaled back is just to return to a decentralized understanding of power. Then people in California could do their thing, and people in Florida and people in Oklahoma could do their thing. And we wouldn't have to all be fighting like cats and dogs over who's going to control the presidency. Right now all this power has been concentrated in the executive branch of the federal government. That was never intended. And that has become the source of so much conflict. If you say really simply, what's the big divide in America? Biden, Trump, right? Hillary Clinton, Trump, right? It's about who's going to control that enormously powerful weapon that is the executive office of the president, and to then wield it against the people who you consider to be your
Right,
enemies.
right,
We got to
right,
lock them up. We got to,
right.
they're the deplorables. And so this is a very dangerous situation. It's like having a loaded machine gun on the ground, and two factions that have been told to hate each other are now duking it out for who can grab hold of that machine gun and wipe out the other side. It's a very, very dangerous situation. If we just eliminate that machine gun and say nobody's going to have that power, that would go a long way toward helping us fix this. And we could do the same thing at the state level. There's, like, I live in Florida. There's no reason why a decision about my zoning regulations needs to be made in Tallahassee. My city council is very close to the people. I know my city councilors. I know my mayor, my county commission, right? I know the members of my county commission. Go ahead.
Let me intersect though, if I may. So a lot of people, it sounds like you're saying federalism, a return to federalism, some sort
I don't
of
think that would solve all the problems, but I think it would contribute to ratcheting down the tension a little bit.
reduce the tension. And I've heard many other people say this. If the federal government doesn't have these incredible powers, then when somebody gets elected that you don't like, you don't have to worry. California freaks out when Trump gets elected. Texas freaks out when Biden gets elected and Hillary. There certainly is a pattern of states that are large freaking out when some president gets elected that's the opposite of their opinion, and then immediately talking about secession. And when I talk to people, that's new. You haven't really seen that since 1860. A state goes, oh, is this guy president? We're out. I mean, that's now you got Texas, California, I think New Hampshire, some other states did that. But let me push back, if I may.
Sure.
With fair warning, we don't do gotcha journalism. We do fair journalism. So it's about political division, but I'm going to push back. Some people have said, hey, federalism's the answer. Okay. There was this thing called Roe v. Wade. And there was this group called the Supreme Court of America, and they overturned Roe v. Wade. And they didn't get rid of it. They kicked it back to the states. Now, I'm in California, and I had a lot of friends in New York. Nobody here or New York was saying, hey, we're cool, we got it back to our states. It was, oh my God, they took away a woman's right to choose. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. We're all going to die. I was trying to go, hey, do you remember it's kicked back to the states? This is Cali. We're never going to take away that right. We're totally no registry at all. Just our rights were taken away. Let's send people we spent our money to advertise in Florida for people to come and get abortions over here with our campaign money. So, and people thought that was a great idea. Now, let's flip the coin. You have the Republican Party who for decades have said, we're about federalism. We're about federalism. These damn Democrats always trying to, okay. It was kicked back to the states. And then one of the highest ranking Republicans says, not good enough. I want a national abortion ban. And he was supported by other Republicans and not repudiated by the Republican Party. So if we have one party that doesn't want anything to do with this, and we have another party that was the purveyor of federalism and then completely committed a hypocritical action for the first time they had a chance to achieve it in 3 decades, what chance do we have for real federalism to return?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good point. But I would argue that abortion is kind of a unique issue. First of all, the lack of federalism is what caused this debate, or at least what threw fuel on the dumpster fire. I was not around back then, but almost all of the states had criminalized abortion, and it was always understood that murder laws are a state responsibility. So the Supreme Court is really the ones that disrupted this process. But I would argue here that this abortion is a unique issue because, as our founder said in the Declaration of Independence, which I've quoted already, God created us equally and God endowed us with certain unalienable rights. The very first of these is the right to life. And they actually said the purpose of government is to protect the right to life. Now, we talked about amendments, right? Our people decided overwhelmingly that there were certain rights that we thought they were so important that we couldn't just trust the states anymore to guarantee those because of a number of reasons, right? Some states thought, we should allow human beings to be held in slavery. And of course, that's ridiculous. You have no right to own a slave. There were some states that were discriminating against certain people based on arbitrary characteristics, like skin tone, things like this. And so we decided as a nation, and again, the process of amending our Constitution is very difficult, and it was done that way for a reason, and I fully support that. I think that was a very wise decision of our founders to make it exceedingly difficult. You have to have a massive consensus to adopt these changes. But when we adopted certain amendments, take the 14th Amendment as one example, we said, look, some of these God-given rights are so important that we're not going to allow as a union any state to infringe on those rights. Now, I understand that most of the people who support abortion do not regard an unborn baby as a human being, as a person. I would radically disagree with that. This is a person. It's just a person who is not born yet. Okay, and there's all these different arguments. Whatever. We don't have to get into the
Can't get
specifics
into
of
it,
it.
but yeah.
But my point is, we decided as a people to guarantee certain rights for everyone at the federal level through the 14th Amendment. And so I actually think Dobbs was a dangerous, the decision that overturned Roe versus Wade was dangerous in a very serious way. Right, just a few days before the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, they ruled against the state of New York on a gun issue. They said the state of New York was infringing on the gun rights of citizens of New York. And under the 14th Amendment, that was not allowed. They had to respect the rights of the people, and especially their Second Amendment rights. And okay, fine, that's an acceptable decision. We can debate the merits of the 14th Amendment, whether it's still necessary today, whatever. But that is what's in the Constitution. Our people overwhelmingly supported it, and so that's what it is today. Well, if the state of New York can't deprive you of your gun rights, in what universe can we say that it's acceptable for a state to deprive you of your right to life, right? Your right to life being the absolute most critical of all your rights. You can't enjoy any other right if you don't have your right to life. If a quote unquote doctor sticks a tube in your skull and sucks out your brain, you can't enjoy your Second Amendment protected right to own a gun. You can't enjoy your First Amendment protected rights to free speech or freedom of religion. And so in the case of abortion, I think it's a unique issue. Abortion, I believe, at the federal level really should be criminalized. And yes, that'll cause division. Our people have been indoctrinated, they've been radicalized, and many of them have been convinced, I think through manipulation, that it's some sort of freedom or right to kill their baby.
Okay, just for the algorithms, we gotta let me summarize if I may. I get what you're saying, that
Yep.
I think what you're saying is, that was a special issue. Don't take the reaction of Republicans as a standard for federalism. Okay, but this party has been talking about federalism for decades. They got a major break. They did not back it. That's still a fact. Like, you guys had a chance after decades and you acted like hypocrites. Why should we believe that,
Well, I would quibble with the hypocrite label. On any issue that's not enumerated, I think that should be sent, as the 10th Amendment states, to the states or to the people.
Sure.
But your right to life is specifically enumerated.
Sure. So federalism might be the answer. Still hope for federalism. Okay. Let me ask you, as we're winding down, do you have any questions for us? Is there any things you wanted to talk about? Any particular issues? Is there something you wanted to go into?
I would add one more thing because you asked me for ways that we could try to heal these divisions.
Yes, please.
And I mentioned federalism, and I think that's an important one. I don't know that these divisions can be healed at this point, frankly. But I think in terms of things that might help bring that further along, I also believe the education system needs to be addressed. And I'm not alone on this anymore. I've been saying for over a decade, parents, you got to get your kids out of the public schools. But the public schools have become such a source of conflict because everybody wants to grab the public schools and have them teach what they want taught. And so the left wants left-wing values taught. The left wants abortion taught. The right wants their understanding of American history taught. And so there have been some really prominent legal scholars who've commented on this. Professor Hamburger at Columbia University has talked about, maybe the public school system is unconstitutional because it compels speech, because it's a violation of the First Amendment. Attorney General Bill Barr has come out and said, at least as presently constituted, the public school system is unconstitutional because it's basically using the state to give children these religious ideas that in most cases today are contrary to the religious values and ideas of their parents. And so I think one way to really ease the tensions is to get the government out of education and go back to a free market. If we had a free market and parents were all free to choose where their children were going to school, we wouldn't have to go scream at each other at school boards about whether boys are going to be allowed in girls' bathrooms or whether they're going to teach the 1619 Project or, the 1776 commission that Trump put together. These wouldn't be issues because every parent then would be responsible for making that choice for their children And I believe through free market forces, when government intervenes in the economy, it almost always leads to disastrous results. And that, collective agriculture in the Soviet Union is an obvious example.
Mm.
All the industries that were collectivized under Adolf Hitler, right? Cars, Volkswagen, it always leads to problems. But when you have a free market, consumers, through their own purchasing decisions, will guide that in the direction that they want. And I believe if parents as consumers were able to choose how they wanted their children to be educated, and they had a real stake in the game more than just voting for your school board member, which at this point is totally meaningless anyway, that would really help ease the tension. I wouldn't have to go scream at my neighbor. I wouldn't have to care where he sends his kid to school. And I believe through the free market, the whole system would gradually become better education. We'd gradually move back to the values that were foundational to America. And so I think that would really help a lot. And the same thing with the media. I could add to that. There's no reason why Congress should be subsidizing NPR or PBS. There's no reason why Congress should be buying billions of dollars, or the executive branch in this case, buying billions of dollars worth of ads to tell you to get your shots and stuff. Stop the government subsidies for the media and let the free market determine. And I think some people will say that would contribute to the polarization. I disagree 100%. So those are some that I could come up with. And again, I don't know that it could be healed, but I think each of these would contribute to at least easing the tension.
I like that you had ideas. You had specific ideas. I like that. Turn to federalism, the kids. I don't want to get into it, but I do want to point out Bill Clinton, when he was graduating college, did write a research paper talking about how the elites are awesome. I forget, there was some book talking about the real life elites and the real life billionaires, and he wrote kind of a college paper talking about how they're great. That's a fact. Epstein Island is now a fact. It was called conspiracy for years, and people were said that you're crazy. That is a proven fact. And Bohemian Grove was also considered crazy in a theory, and that is also a fact. I don't want to talk about it. I'm just throwing you a bone. For the Algrams, thank you for being understanding. Appreciate it. Do you have any? Okay. Let's do the last minute thought. So this is something I always ask everybody. Picture you're somebody watching this interview. You're not yourself. You're somebody on the outside. You're watching this interview. And we've been talking for a little bit, and it's been great. Somebody's watching this interview. They've been following along. But 5 days from now, they're going to say to themselves, there was this interview and it was very fascinating. There was a lot of material, but there was this one thing this guy said, and it's 5 days later, and I can't get it out of my head. What is that super sticky thought you would like the public to be left with?
Maybe just this polarization that we're seeing is actually it's being deliberately engineered. It's part of an agenda, and I think as Americans we need to all take a step back and realize that our neighbor is not our enemy just because he's got a Biden sign or a Trump sign. We're being conditioned, we're being trained, we're being manipulated into hating our neighbor. We're being manipulated into hating our fellow Americans. And this is by people who are very nefarious, who don't have our best interests at heart. So I think we need to recognize that we can disagree without becoming vitriolic, without becoming violent. And I think as a nation, actually, not just as a nation, but even as individuals, as families, as communities, we're going to have to do this if we don't want to end up in the kind of thing that so many other nations and peoples have ended up with throughout even just the last 100 years. There's innumerable examples. And, will it end up like Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis? Hopefully not. But this path that we are on as a nation is incredibly dangerous. There are vested interests that are deliberately turning you against your neighbors. And so take a step back, cool it. Go back to the values your parents taught you, right? The golden rule, love your neighbor like love yourself. Treat your neighbor how you want to be treated. And I think a lot of this hatred, a lot of this vitriol, a lot of this extremism would wither away very, very quickly. And then we can proceed to have actual discussions about how we want things to be. And it doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but at least we don't have to be at each other's throats. So I really do hope people will recognize we're being manipulated, we're being duped. And I would say that's really the takeaway. Don't fall for it. Don't be manipulated. Just try to love your neighbor. It's critically important.
I always get fascinating answers when I ask that, and I never know where it's going to go. Do you know anybody who'd be willing to be part of an interview? I hope you feel that this wasn't gotcha journalism.
No,
and
not at
it's
all. I
straightforward.
thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thought you were very honest and transparent about where you're coming from, and so I had a great time.
I appreciate that. If you know anybody who's thoughtful and is willing to be part of an honest conversation, we would love to talk to them. If you know anybody, please send me some recommendations. I'd really appreciate it. I'll send you the copy of the video in a few hours. If you know
Perfect.
anybody,
Yeah.
I hope that
Why
you
don't you
felt
send me
better.
a list of like things that you want in an interview subject? And I've got a fairly big Rolodex. I'll be happy to send over some names to you. Just tell me kind of what field of work, what political perspectives. I'd be happy to send you some people. You just tell me kind of what you're looking for, and I'll find some.
Okay, I will do that. Basically, anybody who can talk about political division from an educated standpoint. So they could be a professor, or they could be a writer like you, somebody who's spent some, you don't have to be a professor. You could have spent time observing, being aware. We want all the interviews to be high level and thoughtful. So we've talked to activists, but they were activists who were on the ground for a decade. We've talked to reporters, but they were reporters who've been around for a little while. So anybody thoughtful who could answer these questions, and they can come from a hardcore left, hardcore right, ultra right perspective. We don't care. It's just that what we noticed was the debate in the media kind of went like this: all you red states get more money than you put into the federal system. You don't know how well you have it. You guys are idiots. Oh yeah, well, all you Democrats are all pedophiles and you have pedophile rings. No, you're this. No, you're that. No, you're this. No, you're that. No, you're okay, done. And that's what I saw on network TV on both sides. And I'm like, this
Yep.
is madness, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So
All right.
anybody who can form complete sentences and speak in a thoughtful manner is who we want to talk to. I'll send you an email in a few hours. I appreciate
Perfect. I've got some names already, so I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and we'll catch up later.
it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Have a good one.